Some Zombies Are Nice. Written and read by Shan McFadden. Some zombies are mean. They snarl and growl and bite. If they saw you walking down the street, they might chase you and try to eat your brain. If they saw you at the beach, they might pop your beach ball on purpose and then chase you and try to eat your brain. And if they came to your birthday party, they might smash all of your presents, pop all of your balloons, then eat your cake and your brains. But some zombies are nice, too. They might send you flowers when you're sick, or pay for your ticket at the movies, or fix your bicycle when it's broken. They might listen to you when you're sad, or give you a boost when you're trying to reach something on the top shelf. This story is about a nice zombie, the nicest zombie, in fact. A nice, sweet zombie named Frank. Frank was kind and gentle and always willing to lend a hand. He told funny jokes and knew a lot about music and movies and how to fix things. He never forgot people's birthdays, and he always told the truth. Although Frank was a very nice zombie, people weren't always nice to him. They were usually scared of him just because he looked so strange and different. His skin was a grayish-green color, and his eyes were big and googly. He smelled a bit like a damp basement or a wet dog. His voice was all moany and groany and sounded like someone dragging a bunch of tin cans down a gravel road. And because he was a zombie, sometimes Frank's body parts, like his hand or his ear or his eyeball, would just fall right off and bounce around on the floor. It didn't hurt him at all. It was just part of being a zombie, and he could easily reattach them, but it made other people very uncomfortable. It made other people think that Frank was scary and weird. But you know what's funny? Sometimes it's the things that make us seem weird that also make us so very, very special. Frank's best friend was a little girl named Zoe. Zoe was a very special little girl because she made up her own mind about things and didn't worry too much about what other people thought. She loved Frank because he was so kind and considerate and funny. But the first time Zoe brought Frank over to play, her parents didn't like Frank at all. Her mother and father took one look at Frank, and then her mother said, "Little girls simply should not be friends with zombies." "But why not?" said Zoe. "Because look at him, dear," said father, pointing at Frank. "His clothes are torn and dirty, and he has a very unpleasant smell about him." "So what?" said Zoe. "And his skin is green and moldy, and it looks like he's missing some fingers," said mother. "And an ear," added father. "That doesn't matter at all," said Zoe. "Darling, zombies like to eat people," said mother. "He hasn't tried to bite you, has he? Or chomp you?" "Or chew you?" said father. "Not even just a nibble?" "No, no, no, and no," said Zoe with a frown. "Frank wouldn't do that." Then Zoe crossed her arms and said, "You told me that you shouldn't judge people based on how they look. So just because Frank's a zombie, that doesn't mean that he's a bad person." Father looked at mother, and mother looked back at father, and then he sighed and said, "By golly, you're right. You are a very, very smart little girl, and I'm proud of you. We've behaved just terribly." "Completely discourteous," said mother, shaking her head. "Because in this house," said father, "we believe that all men are equal." "And women," added mother. "That's right, of course," said father. "In fact, in this house, women are even more equal than men. Twice as equal, even." Then he turned to Frank and said, "Frank, I hope you can accept my apology. Is there any way you'd forgive me?" And Frank smiled his crooked zombie smile and said, "Rrrr." When father tried to shake Frank's hand, the poor zombie's arm came right off. Mother gasped, and Frank looked very embarrassed. But thinking quickly, father said, "Sorry, Frank. I used to play a lot of football back in college, and I guess I built up quite a grip." "Oh, it's true," said mother, doing her part. "He yanks his friend's arms off all the time." Then father gently passed the disembodied arm back to Frank. With a pop, Frank reattached it. "Are you okay, Frank?" asked Zoe with a concerned tone. Frank lifted his newly reattached arm and gave her a big thumbs up. Everybody laughed, even Frank, although Frank's laugh sounded a bit like someone being sick. Mother and father invited Frank to stay for dinner. As Frank and Zoe were washing up, she leaned over to him and whispered, "Sorry, Frank, my parents are kind of crazy." Frank grinned and said, "Mother wasn't sure what to make for dinner. She'd never cooked for a zombie before. She knew that zombies like to eat brains, but she was fairly certain that she didn't have any brains in the refrigerator. Father offered to pick up some brains at the butcher shop, but Mother wouldn't have it. She was worried what the neighbors might say if they saw Father carrying a bag of brains home. Plus, she said that there was no way she'd be able to get the smell of cooked brains out of the drapes and carpets. Father mentioned that zombies only like to eat raw brains, but Mother thought that uncooked brains were a food poisoning risk, and she didn't want people to think that she was the kind of woman that would take the health of her guests lightly. While Mother and Father deliberated over what to do, Zoe rooted through the refrigerator and came up with a perfect solution. Everyone sat down for the wonderful dinner that Mother had prepared. There was soup and salad, potatoes and peas, and a host of other savory delights. But the last thing Mother put on the table was a big steaming head of cooked cauliflower that looked just like a big, juicy white brain. Mother set it down right in front of Frank and watched as his eyes lit up and his mouth began to water. Frank licked his lips and said, "Oh." "You're very welcome, Frank," beamed Mother. "Please, enjoy." And Frank did enjoy. He ate the entire cauliflower, and even tried a little bit of the soup just to be polite. The cauliflower gave Frank terrible gas, but no one really noticed because he smelled so bad already. During dinner, Mother and Father fussed over Frank and asked him all kinds of questions. Frank would say, and Father would respond with, "Well put, Frank, very insightful." Then Frank would say, and Mother would say, "That's so kind, Frank, you have the loveliest manners." After dinner, Frank and Zoe sat on the floor and put together a big puzzle of a unicorn while Mother and Father cleaned up. Frank had offered to wash the dishes, but Mother and Father refused, saying that no guest of theirs would be expected to do dishes. Then everyone said goodnight, and Mother and Father told Frank that he was a delightful guest and that he was welcome back any time. But later that night, as Zoe was brushing her teeth, Father looked out the window and said, "Honey, is that Frank standing outside in the rain?" And sure enough it was. He was standing at the end of their laneway, picking up loose bottles and cans from the street and placing them in people's recycling bins. The wind was blowing and it had just started raining. "Frank doesn't have a home," said Zoe sadly. "But doesn't he have a zombie family to come home to?" asked Father with a frown. "No, Daddy, Frank used to be just like us. But one day he got bitten by a zombie and got turned into one too. After that, his family was afraid of him and didn't want him around anymore." "But where does he sleep?" asked Father. "Zombies don't need to sleep," said Zoe. "So Frank just walks around all night cleaning up garbage and making sure that lost cats get back to their owners." "He's quite a remarkable zombie, isn't he?" said Father thoughtfully. Father told Mother about Frank's situation, and she agreed that they couldn't allow a kind and gentle zombie like Frank to be roaming the streets without a home. So they brought Frank in from the rain and invited him to be a part of the family permanently. Father gave Frank his bathrobe and slippers, and Mother made up the guest room with extra blankets and pillows just so Frank would be more comfortable. Zoe pointed out that Frank would probably be most comfortable in the basement, as he tended to like damp, cool places. But Mother said that no newly adopted family member of hers was going to sleep in a musty old basement, even if they might prefer it over a cozy bedroom. So that's how Frank the Zombie came to live in a nice home in the suburbs, wearing a bathrobe and slippers and sleeping in a big fluffy bed with a family all of his own. Mother and Father doted on Frank and bought him a new bicycle and a baseball glove. They introduced Frank to their friends and relatives as "our darling Frank." Mother and Father took Frank and Zoe to the zoo and amusement parks, and once a week they took them swimming at the local swimming pool. Frank and Zoe got to spend every single day together. Frank's favorite thing to do was to accompany Zoe to her weekly figure skating lessons. He'd watch with wide, spellbound eyes as Zoe and her friend Kevin practiced their routine for the upcoming figure skating recital. At the end of every lesson, as Zoe and Kevin rehearsed their final bow, Frank would clap and cheer and give an enthusiastic "Roar." During the long walk home from practice, Frank would wave his arms around, mimicking the spins and twirls and butterfly jumps that he'd seen the children do. Zoe and Kevin would cheer Frank on as he played out his imaginary recital, and as they got closer to home, some of the neighbors would stop and clap as well. "Great twirl, Frank," they would yell, and "Go for the double axel, Frank," they would shout. Frank followed Zoe and Kevin to school each day and played with the children at recess. Zoe's friends loved to climb on Frank's back and get piggyback rides and play hide and seek. But not all of the children were kind. Some of the meaner kids teased Zoe and Kevin for being friends with a zombie, and they would often throw rocks or bits of garbage at Frank when they saw him. One particularly cruel little girl named Alice thought it was funny to call Frank the smelly old zombie. One day, Zoe had enough of her taunting and shouted back, "What do you know, Alice? You didn't even pass the math test." And Alice shouted back, "I did so. I got 92% on the math test. I did much better than you." Zoe pretended to be surprised. 92%, you say? Is that right? Well, with a score that high, you must have a really big brain. A big, juicy brain. Did you hear that, Frank? Alice has a big, juicy brain. Frank opened his eyes really wide and held his hands out in front of him and staggered toward Alice with his head turned to one side and his tongue hanging out and said, Alice and her friends screamed and ran away and never bothered Zoe or Frank again. Zoe and Kevin and Frank lay on the ground and laughed until their sides hurt. They laughed until they thought their eyes might pop out of their heads. In fact, Frank's eyes did pop out of his head and wiggled around on the ground, which only made the children laugh harder. Frank pretended to feel around in the grass, looking for the eyes, while they wriggled out of his grasp. And this made Zoe and Kevin laugh so hard that they had the hiccups for a full 2 hours afterwards. "Frank, you're just the best," giggled Kevin. "Nobody makes me laugh like you, old buddy," smiled Zoe as she patted Frank on the back. Frank just smiled and said, "Roo." As autumn came and the date of the figure skating recital got closer, Frank became a sort of assistant coach for Zoe and Kevin. He'd make sure that Zoe was awake in time to warm up before practice, and he'd pack them snacks and extra sweaters in case they got cold. He'd get them to close their eyes and run through their routine in their minds before they even got on the ice, just so they were completely prepared. Every week, he'd make sure that they were the first ones to the arena and the last ones to leave. On the day of the big performance, Frank was up early, making sure that Zoe's skates were sharpened and that her costume was ironed and ready to go. He even sewed a few extra sequins onto her hairband just so it would look extra sparkly. He made sure that he and Zoe were in the car and buckled in even before Mother and Father were ready to go. "I swear, Frank looks more nervous than Zoe," whispered Father to Mother. "Well, he is a very sweet and considerate zombie after all," Mother smiled back. When they got to the arena, Frank and Zoe waited for Kevin while Mother and Father looked for a good seat in the bleachers. "Where's Kevin?" said Zoe impatiently. "He should have been here by now." A moment later, her question was answered. Kevin came hobbling toward them with his father's arm around him for support. His skates were hanging around his neck, and he was hopping on his left foot while keeping his bare right foot off the floor. "I sprained it," Kevin groaned. "I tripped coming down the arena steps, and now I can't even stand on it." Kevin's right foot was swollen and sore-looking. It had the beginnings of a nasty purple bruise just beginning to blossom around the ankle. "I'm sorry, Zoe," said Kevin with a grimace. "I've ruined everything because I'm so clumsy." He took off his skates and threw them on the floor. Zoe was heartbroken and so was Frank, but they didn't let Kevin see it. Frank put his arm around Kevin to make him feel better, and Zoe just smiled and said, "No big deal, we'll just do it next year instead." Kevin looked like he was going to cry. "But you worked so hard and so did Frank, and now it was all for nothing. It just isn't fair." Zoe was about to say something when Frank tapped her on the shoulder. He was holding Kevin's skates in front of him. He had a very serious look on his face, and he said, "Rrrr." Zoe smiled a sad little smile and said, "Frank, that's very sweet, but Kevin's skates wouldn't fit you even if you did know the routine." Kevin smiled too and said, "It's funny, though, the only person who knows our routine better than us is Frank. I bet he could have done it in his sleep." Zoe shrugged and smiled, and she was just about to take off her skates when she heard a loud pop, followed by another pop a second later. She turned around to see Frank sitting on a folding chair, holding one of his feet in each hand. At the end of his legs was nothing but his little green ankles. He slid them into Kevin's skates and stood up. Without his big zombie feet in the way, Kevin's skates fit him perfectly. "Frank, do you really think you can do it?" squealed Zoe. Frank winked and gave her a big thumbs up and said, "Roar." Moments later, Frank and Zoe were on the ice. The crowd mumbled and murmured as they waited for the performance to start. No one had expected to see a zombie on the ice that day. "Is that Frank?" asked Father from his seat. "It is," gasped Mother. "Frank, what are you doing?" Father smiled and said, "Well, it looks like our Frank is getting his chance to shine." When the music started, Zoe was feeling nervous, but her fears melted away when Frank hugged her and said, "Roar." Zoe closed her eyes and said, "You're right. I've practiced this for months, and I have the best partner ever. Let's go, Frank." They burst into motion, twirling and twisting across the ice. The crowd stood up and cheered as Zoe and Frank did their moves in a perfect synchronized motion. They nailed the loop jump, the flip jump, the Lutz jump, and even the double Lutz jump, and never once did Frank falter or slip. It was as though he'd done the routine a million times, and in a way he had. Frank did a series of fancy twirls and twists and then grabbed Zoe by the hands. They spun in a circle, going faster and faster while the audience applauded. Whispered Frank. "A double twist lift," Zoe whispered back. "Are you crazy? I've never even tried one before." But Frank just smiled and nodded, and Zoe said, Okay, let's try it." Then Frank twirled quickly and threw Zoe right over his head. She spun straight up into the air, rotating rapidly in a series of tight spirals. For a moment it was as though time had stopped for her. The crowd seemed to be frozen in mid-clap. She could see her parents beaming at her from their seats, Kevin cheering with his arms in the air, and when she looked down, all she could see was Frank's face. He looked happier than she'd ever seen him. His eyes were closed and his yellow zombie teeth shone like muddy diamonds under the bright lights. And then she was falling again, right into Frank's arms. He boosted Zoe onto his shoulders, and they prepared for the grand finale. Zoe stretched her arms out wide. Frank stood tall on one leg, while his other leg stuck out at a 90-degree angle, parallel to the ice. Frank and Zoe spun and spun like a top, going faster and faster until they were almost a blur, while the crowd shouted and stomped their feet in appreciation. Then suddenly there was a cry of terror from the crowd as Frank's raised leg flew off, skate and all, and went whirling off into the audience. Frank wobbled on his single leg and nearly dropped Zoe, but he regained his balance and slowly came to a stop, just as the music finished. Frank lowered her to the ground as the crowd erupted in wild applause and celebration. Everyone in the arena was laughing and cheering. Kevin limped over to Zoe and Frank and hugged them both as the celebration continued. Mother fought her way through the crowd and showered the triumphant duo in hugs and kisses. Father described the performance as being somewhere between miraculous and legendary, and offered to take everyone out for ice cream to celebrate. Zoe hugged Frank and said, "We did it! We did it!" A man pushed his way through the throng and stood quietly in front of Frank. He was tall and thin and had blonde hair and a little blonde mustache. Zoe thought he looked quite a bit like Frank. "Franklin," said the man in a soft voice. "Franklin, is that you?" Frank turned slowly and looked the man in the face. Then he lowered his eyes and stared at the ground. Zoe had never seen Frank look so ashamed. Said Frank faintly. The man took a step closer and said, "Franklin, it's me, your father. I wanted to apologize for the terrible way I treated you before, back when you first got zombified. I'd always been taught that zombies were mean and dangerous, but that was wrong, and I was wrong. I shouldn't have been so cruel and ignorant to you. You deserved better. I also wanted to tell you how much I admired your wonderful performance today. You are truly an elegant and graceful skater, something you inherited from your mother, I suppose." Said Frank. "And I wanted to return your leg, which struck me in the head as I was enjoying your delightful routine." He handed the disembodied leg to Frank. "Fortunately, I wasn't hit with the skate blade, lest I might not be here to ask for your forgiveness. Would you, Frank? Would you be willing to forgive me for my deplorable behavior?" Frank looked up with a little tear in his eye and said, Frank's father began to cry. He hugged Frank and said, "Son, that was the kindest thing you could have said to me right now." And so it was that our dear Frank found that he had two families that day. He continued to live with Mother and Father and Zoe, who refused to ever give him up. But he had many visits from the man with the blonde mustache, his true father, to whom he'd given his full forgiveness. The people at the arena never forgot that day, or Zoe and Frank's routine, and every year they would line up to see if the famous duo could top their most recent performance. And every year they did. And everyone, from Mother and Father, to the children at school and the man with the thin blonde mustache, learned a very important lesson about judging people based on how they look or how strange they might be. Because some zombies are mean, but some zombies are nice too, and you might not know which kind you're dealing with unless you get the chance to know them first.
This story was written and read by Shan McFadden. Music by audionautics.com.